Sandrine, you've been working on grand challenges for a very long time, both from a policy perspective, from a business advisory role, and in your role as co-chairman of the Club of Rome, of course. You've been working on this new book that has just come out with a really intriguing title, Earth for All. Mm-hmm. Maybe you'd like to give us your synthetic view about what we mean by Earth for All?
What we've tried to do, and I say we because there are 6 authors that have put their pen to the book, but in addition to that, a series of different contributors, including all of the system dynamic modelers that worked with us, and also in particular the Transformational Economics Commission, which brought thought leaders, decision makers, and economists and scientists from across the globe. This report was really to mark the anniversary of the Limits to Growth. The Limits to Growth, which came out in 1972, was a seminal report of the Club of Rome and demonstrated already in 1972 that through system dynamic modeling, which was undertaken by predominantly Dana Meadows and Dennis Meadows as a team with their researchers, that we could see that we were starting to really meet some challenges in terms of the finite planet and the planetary boundaries. Those challenges were very much interrelated between, for example, the way in which our population was growing. In fact, we speak about in the 1970s, we were an empty world around 3 billion. Now we're obviously a full world of people with demands that have only increased in terms of our natural resource use. And therefore, the growing tipping points that we're starting to see today were already depicted through the scenarios of the Limits to Growth. What we wanted to do in this 50th anniversary year, which was actually last year, was bring together a new team of system dynamic modelers, led also by Jürgen Randers, one of the original authors of The Limits to Growth, together with the Potsdam Institute and Johan Rockström's leadership on the planetary boundaries. And then these transformational economic commissioners that could stress test the results from the system dynamic modeling to understand in what we call this human problématique, which is very much what the thinking of the Club of Rome has been about. When you need to unpack wicked problems, what then are the solutions? What are the potential pathways to change? And that was really the goal of the group coming together, was to think through systems change, what then do we need to do? What is the vision of a future that will enhance greater well-being? And so for us, an Earth for All is a way to depict not only a planet, but a series of interrelated societal systems that are much more holistic and actually servicing people, planet, and prosperity together. For us not only to survive and get out of the mess that we've created, but also to thrive.
That's fascinating. So let's get into the meat of it. So, what are the key ideas, insights that the book provides to, I guess, fundamentally policymakers in order to start working with the sufficient speed and effectiveness towards realizing this vision of the Earth for All?
So the book is not just targeted to policymakers. The book was also targeted to a broader public. I think one of the key realizations that we had coming in particular out of the Club of Rome and the history of the Limits to Growth was we wanted to make sure that this book would be accessible, that it would be accessible to a variety of different audiences. And we did a lot of discussing of what does that mean. For us, that accessibility had to take some very clear directions. One is not be too long. And so it's 175 pages, condensed from all of the incredible work that we did. 2 was to bring in storytelling. So we actually depict and show very clearly the lives of 4 women. They start off as girls and then finish off as women, and show the difference in 2 key scenarios. If we had a too little, too late scenario, which is one of the scenarios which is really a business as usual scenario, what would it look like in their lives in order to show the difference in different continents, but also overall that actually we would see some real great similarities in terms of climate impacts, in terms of potential growing pandemics, conflicts, difficulties in really thriving on a planet that was clearly starting to hit very deep tipping points in terms of biodiversity loss, climate change, etc., but also deep social tipping points. And in fact, what we're able to show through that first scenario is that the social tension graph and the index that we've been able to create demonstrates that as wealth has been going up, especially up until now, but also in the too little, too late scenario, we see that wealth goes up only in the pockets of a few and is not properly distributed to enable well-being. And that differential creates deep social tension. And what's interesting, Maurizio, is that that is what I would really call today's world. I mean, we see it on the continent of Europe in terms of the energy poverty that has increased, and yet the windfall profits that we see in the oil and gas sector right now. Exxon just released its greatest profits ever on the back of people who are truly suffering from not being able to access either low carbon energy or cheaper energy sources. So that is the first. That is the too little, too late scenario. And really what comes out of there is the depth of the inequality is what is going to be our greatest problem and challenge. Then we go into the other scenario. And remember, we're trying to depict the shift in the lives of these four women and the differences that we see. Now, if we go into a giant leap scenario, we've been able to demonstrate that if we focus on poverty, inequality, empowerment, and food and energy as the underbelly of needs, but also very much linked to ensuring that those five are working together to alleviate poverty and to alleviate inequality and to empower women as part of our societies, not only in terms of being on boards, which we talk about in the West, but very much being a part of the economy. Then we start to see that through the giant leap scenario, and by putting in place solutions, most of which we know, by the way. I mean, I often talk about the fact that if we could get rid of perversities in our existing economic and financial system, we'd be halfway there, even just applying the solutions that we know we have. So the beauty of what we're trying to do is 5 turnarounds, get us to the giant leap, and get us to overarching much more a well-being state. Because, and that is the key, we've alleviated inequality, we've alleviated poverty, and most important, we're starting to focus on a new type of economic system that is shifting from an extractive economy of pure consumption around productivity into an economy that measures environment, social, and economic indicators together.
And what about the costs of all of this? Because everything you said obviously makes perfect sense. Some people would say can't afford all of that.
So if we look in particular at the energy, as I said, and food sectors as right now being the underbelly of change and ensuring that people actually can thrive and not just survive, and we address then within that poverty alleviation and inequality alleviation, we're looking at about 2 to 4% GDP cost per annum globally. Now, the highest extremes would go up to 8%, but the lowest could be around 2%. And as I said, a lot of that also is addressing the perversities in our existing economy. Looking at the way in which we subsidized fossil energy, for example, or the way in which we're subsidizing industrial production of food. Looking at the way in which we address trade deficits or neo-colonial and unholy alliances in terms of our dependencies. Coming back to local production for local consumption. Coming back to also the demand side. How do we reduce our dependency on materials to allow for our planet to start to thrive? But also, how do we ensure that we cost externalities? The cost of cutting down a forest, the cost of biodiversity loss. And what does that look like?
If we then take the perspective of the private sector, right? What does all of this mean, in your view, for the way that business organizations need to also wake up and heed the call?
So it's interesting because to finish our last conversation around cost, we have to remember the cost of inaction. And some of the work that I've been doing myself as an advisor to the European Commission, for example, on how do we ensure that we are looking at green assets rather than brown assets? How do we shift capital? And the big question right now, and something that I think is the key elephant in the room, is, first of all, can we continue, either as business leaders or as policy leaders, to enable the existing market system that we have, which is not placing a value on truly what is most essential in people's lives and livelihoods? Because the over-financialization of the economy means that today you could fire anywhere between 5 people to 10,000 people and shareholder value goes up. Now, have we taken into consideration the real cost of that transaction? No. What we've enabled is shareholder value to go up on the back of a loss of 10,000 people, which actually is a cost to the economy because we now have unemployment, unless they've all been shifted.
But not to the firm.
But not to the firm. So there needs to be a fundamental shift before we can even bring the private sector on board in terms of a shift in the business model. We need to think through what is the new economy? What is, and actually, it's also the old economy. I mean, how do we get away from the current extractive economy and the focus on over-financialization and back to a proper social contract between employer and employee? Between, even if we are now talking about so many people that are contractors in the service industry, no longer in a relationship which is employee and employer. What then does that mean in terms of their role in society? How do we ensure that the future of work is a future of the labor market, which makes sense for the continued development of a civilization that moves towards well-being? These are much bigger questions than just coming up with new business models. This is about how do we actually model the future, and what does that future look like? We're living in a constrained world. We no longer, because we are a full world, we cannot use the resources that we have used to get us to where we are today in the same way. We must change. So the dynamics between employer and employee has to change. The dynamics between supply and demand has to change. The dynamics between the finance system and the economic system has to change. And then the business leader has to think, okay, well, how do I create a business then that takes into consideration that servicing of people, planet, and prosperity? There are some short-term indicators that are moving us in a potential direction, which would be much more positive. One, obviously, is that we could enhance ESG, because obviously ESG is full of greenwashing. It unfortunately now has a reputational risk, in particular in the United States, and therefore we need to think, okay, well, what is environment, social, and governance principles? What does that really mean? We see that there is a big move in terms of purpose-driven models for business leaders. We look at Patagonia, for example, or some of the ways in which some leaders, Paul Polman, who very clearly indicated to his shareholders that he wanted to look at different reporting structures because the short-termism and the profit motives that were purely the determinant for the relationship that we had with shareholders and also reporting to the rest of the world had nothing to do with the real robustness of the company. And I'll end with this. Beyond thinking that this is so futuristic that it might be very complicated, and that actually many policy leaders and also business leaders say, oh, transformation, we can't do that, especially right now because we are in a high inflation climate, we are having difficulties with regard to energy poverty, et cetera, et cetera. Too complicated, let's just stay with business as usual. I'd like to argue that we can see that those companies that have been most resilient to shocks and stresses are those that actually have looked through their value chain and stress tested their value chain against ESG principles. And we saw that. In fact, we saw that ESG investments tripled during COVID because we saw a reliance on good business practices that had stress tested the full value chain. I also see that the economies that did the best during COVID were those that actually were the well-being economies. The well-being economies of Scotland, of New Zealand, of Wales, of Finland, of Iceland. And now we can see that there is a growing group of countries, including Canada, but also the European Union as a region, that are looking at well-being indicators as ways to actually put in place a value on what is most essential in national accounts. So there is a shift. And I think we need to tap into that shift and work with business leaders that are progressive, that are ready to take that leap of faith, but also firmly believe that a good social contract, building through resilient value chains, is the way to become stronger in the future. And maybe shareholder value will go down for a while. But actually something a banker said to me, a Swiss banker very recently, around the taxonomy, which was a very difficult process to be part of and didn't give us everything that we wanted in terms of evaluating what was green, in particular since gas and nuclear were included in the end, which was a political deal. But he did say to me, you know, Sandrine, what the taxonomy has done is it has given us a framework, a structure that we can point to determine resilience to future shocks, to start to demonstrate to those actually that we need to convince that we need to shift out of certain assets, that this is the way forward, and this is where policy is going to go. And so even if it's difficult, we need to put in place those anchors of what a right future would look like for business leaders. And yes, it will mean giving up some profits. But let's not forget, business leaders are individuals too. Business leaders need to look at their kids. They need to think through where they stand in society. And I'm hopeful that the depth of knowledge of some business leaders that continuing to move in the progression that we've seen so far is not the right thing, that they should be on the right side of history.
Thank you, Sandrine. You've given us so much food for hopefully not only thought, but also for action at different levels. It is my opinion that the real problem is not with profit per se, is profit for what, right? Because we are convinced that profit is the end goal, whereas profit is a mean to ends, and the ends are prosperity, are people and planets, are basically different ways to create different forms of value. And so that shift in mindset is really at the heart of the problem. Thank you very, very much, Sandrine.
Thank you, Maurizio. And I fully agree with you.